Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Good morning everyone. My name is Madhvi Jha. I am from Janki Devi Memorial College, University of Delhi. Today we will be speaking about rise and fall of fascism in Europe and in Japan. The term fascism is derived from the Italian word fascisco, meaning band, league or union. In its political sense, it was first used for the street fighting combat groups that emerged in Italy after the First World War. It thus started out as an ideology of a radical fringe and became a political attitude and a mass movement. Fascism in Italy and Nazism in Germany became most powerful and are seen as genuinely fascist movement. In Germany, the word Nazi was the abbreviation for National Socialist German Workers' Party, which was founded during 1919-20. It developed into fascist movement led by Hitler. Besides, during this interwar period of 28 countries in Europe and as many as 16 turned to dictatorships. The leaders in Russia aimed to apply the principle of communism to create a workers' state. This is described as dictatorship of the left. Such an effort was made in Hungary too, but here it did not last. All the other dictatorships sought to establish authoritarian states and did not aim at mass mobilization. Fascism did not remain a European phenomenon. In Japan, a militarist regime emerged in the 1930s, but the use of the term fascist in relation to Japan is disputed. Eventually, these three countries, Germany, Italy and Japan, joined the ideological alliance during 1936-37. The Anti-Comintern Pact and in 1940 concluded a military alliance and fought the Second World War together. Nazism in Germany under Hitler emerged as most horrific. Hitler developed the most determined view of the superiority of the German race, which he called Aryan. He also used the resources of a modern state to annihilate specific groups of people in the most brutal manner. It was a movement based on instinct and will. Secondly, the movement lacked coherence. Therefore, experts have to deal with a number of complex and contradictory theoretical issues as well as changing realities. Even within one country, it is difficult to discern a coherent ideology because to attain power and then to sustain it, the fascists readily abandoned any principle. Mussolini, the chief proponent of fascism, was himself an opportunist. Once in power, he made many compromises with the establishment. Dennis Smith, who has written extensively on Italian history and Mussolini, says that there was little consistency and much opportunism in Mussolini's behavior, whose views change according to the demands of the situation. Thirdly, fascist ideas and methods were adopted in many countries, and in each country fascism was influenced by national circumstances. The features of fascism. The fascist governmental system was led by a dictator who was seen as a reliable and who enjoyed complete power. The cult of the leader was as an essential part of the fascist program, and an elaborate superstructure was imposed on top of it. It met a deep psychological need, and one can say that it responded to public demand rather than creating it. The leader was sustained by popular adulation. He had a cadre-based movement, and there was nothing democratic about these cadres. The cadres were hierarchically structured, from whom unquestioned obedience to the leader and the nation was demanded. Fascist movement had a core myth of national rebirth and regeneration. They believed in the necessity of destroying the then existing political form and in different ways aimed at the establishing of a new order based on new values. They had nothing but dislike for communism and democracy. Towards capitalism, their attitude remained uncertain. Fascist states attempted to impose complete control over all aspects of life: political, social, cultural, and economic. The fascist movements assigned to the nation an unquestionable primacy. They emphasized that the nation had a predestined role in history and that it must promote the well-being of its people by providing adequate natural resources, even by grabbing additional territory. Hence, they looked upon war as a means of strengthening the nation and of making it a world power. They inculcated commitment to offer one's life for the nation and gradually readiness to offer one's life even without understanding the reasons began to play an important role. In Italy, such traditions were not significant, yet the romanticism associated with the struggle for unification and the national humiliation caused by the First World War had led to propagandist transfiguration. Further, fascist states propagated theories of racial superiority. They identified goodness and superiority within us, and the logical result was that evil was identified with them. This led to scapegoating for all opponents. The fascists had a distinctly male, chauvinistic and militaristic ethos. Both Hitler and Mussolini dignified the role of women as mother and homemaker and discouraged women from taking up professions or competing with men. Even most intimate aspects of private life, for example, those relating to production and maternity, were subordinated to the requirements of the nation state. Mussolini used to say that maternity is the patriotism of women. The Nazi state during the Second World War did not employ women in factories. Instead, foreigners from conquered countries were employed. It is notable that a substantial section of women supported Hitler because he seemed to bolster the institution of family in troubled times. The most distinguishing feature of fascism, however, was the ruthless drive to attain and hold state power. Now, let's talk about the support for fascism. Popular support was indispensable for the form of power exercised by Mussolini and Hitler. They were highly popular leaders. A very large section of people in Italy and Germany enthusiastically supported the new order that emerged in their countries, while others remained passive spectators. People followed Hitler to the Gulf, and they followed Mussolini almost till Italy lost the war. The original support came from war veterans who felt cheated by the peace settlement of 1919, who did not see any future for themselves in the post-war world and who had to face a grim future after they returned from the war front. The lower middle class, especially small retailers, artisans, and self-employed workers, formed the mainstay of the fascist groups. They had been adversely affected by the process of industrialization, economic dislocation caused by the war and its aftermath. They did not want to join the parties on the left because this was likely to depress their status to that of workers. There is also evidence to suggest that both Mussolini and Hitler got support from a substantial section of peasants and small peasants. Mussolini was surprised by the extent of peasant support as he had visualized fascism as the urban phenomenon. In Italy, since 1918, some 500,000 peasants had managed to acquire small piece of land which they feared they would lose with the success of some socialist alternative. Civil servants and teachers tended to support them because they were disillusioned with the structure of the parliamentary system and indiscipline and corruption in political parties. The upper classes, landowners, businessmen, and industrialists also supported the fascism in Italy and Nazism in Germany. Their support came because of the fear of the left. They hoped that Mussolini and Hitler would provide political stability, law and order, as also deliver a disciplined and constrained workforce. The fascists and Nazis are gained considerably by the respectability and funding brought by the influential section of the society. Idealistic youths and many intellectuals saw it as a revolt against the weakness of mass society and rejoiced the fascism's activities and its glorification of the heroic. They saw in the fascist movement an affirmation of the highest human spiritual qualities, heroism and dedication to one's own people. Thus, they got support from a very wide spectrum of society, though the precise proportion of the various sections that supported them is open to debate. There are a few clues that can explain why complex, technologically advanced modern societies were prepared leaders in this manner. These regimes used propaganda, indoctrination, as well as violence on a large scale to ensure support for the regime. They made very effective use of the instruments provided by modernity, such as technological advances, means of communications, and state bureaucracy for these purposes. Telegraph, telephone, radio, camera, and cinema were all effectively used for propaganda as well as for destruction. Crowds were shown saluting their leaders in Germany and Italy as well as in other states where dictators had established themselves. One can still see the footage of rallies that were organized in the form of public theatre and where frenzied crowds cheered their leaders hysterically, saluted them with cries of "Deuce, Deuce" in Italy or "Hail Hitler" in Germany. The fascists also organized violence to suppress opposition as also to create terror, though the scale of violence varied widely. Their uniform came to signify discipline, readiness for violence. Italian fascists wore black shirts and became known as black shirt, and Nazis as brown shirts. Both in Italy as well as in Germany, all opposition was crushed through state-sponsored terror. Concentration camps were set up in various parts of Germany for detention of political opponents who were mostly communist and socialist. Textbooks became a state monopoly. In Italy, by the late 1930s, the number of approved school textbooks was reduced from 317 to 1. Great emphasis was laid on youth organizations, youth camps, and youth rallies. Above all, Mussolini and Hitler were charismatic leaders who were supported because, as Ian Kershaw shows in his studies of Hitler, people saw in them an embodiment of their own expectations and resentments. They saw their respective leader as the one who would take revenge for the humiliation of 1919 and bring glory, who would provide a strong government that would be above corruption and who would ensure law and order. Origin of Fascism. The sense of humiliation arising out of post-war settlement and the growing fear that the Bolshevik-style revolution would spread. It was also a reaction to the failure of liberal institutions to solve the crushing problems of the modern society as an expression of hostility to democratic values. In Germany, the Great Depression proved to be a catalyst. Besides, Mussolini and Hitler proved to be charismatic leaders who were able to exploit the situation to their advantage. In both countries which had emerged as united countries in 1870s, the liberal traditions had remained weak. The conduct of the government during the war further eroded the credibility of parliamentary democracy. In Germany, some people began to talk about the need for a healthy people living close to land and argued that Germany lacked the space for providing a healthy life to its people. The late 19th century also saw an intellectual revolt in certain sections of the society against what has later been described as modernity. Predominant liberals' values such as rights of individuals, the power of reason and science to bring progress and positivism, etc., came under attack during this time. In Germany as well as Japan, the perceived wrong of 1919 created deep resentment. Germans felt wounded by humiliation inflicted by the Versailles Treaty. Demobilization of soldiers added to problem. In Italy alone, 20 lakh soldiers were demobilized. In the public sphere, national honor, sacrifices in war, and the trench life were glorified. But the truth was that the soldiers had to spend a very difficult time in muddy trenches. On their return, they failed to find employment or a new role in civil life. let's talk about Mussolini and fascism in Italy. Italy was the first country to return to fascism. Italy was the first country to turn to fascism. When Italy entered the war in 1915, Mussolini served in the army until he was wounded in 1917. In March 1919, he founded the fascist movement at a meeting in Milan that was attended by less than 200 persons, mainly interventionists, war veterans, ex-soldiers, etc. It adopted a left-wing radical program, including an 8-hour working day, votes for women and tax on capital. But soon Mussolini and fascists amended this program and began to express themselves in favor of a strong government, regeneration of Italy and security of property. These ideas appealed to the Italians who were tired of weak government and non-achievements in foreign policy and were scared of a spread of Bolshevism. Fascist squad, which became known as black shirts, carried on local struggles and activities against socialists, Catholics and liberals. Mussolini appropriated many aspects of his style, black shirted uniform, salute and making rousing speeches to admiring crowds. Between 1918 and 1922, there were 5 governments in Italy. In November 1919 elections, fascists obtained few votes and no seats. 2 parties, the Catholic Popular Party and the Socialist Party, got more than half the seats between them. But the differences between them were deep-rooted. The former had been formed with the implicit support of the Pope to fight socialism. The result was that rather than cooperating to govern, each devoted its energies to preventing the other from governing. In 1922, Mussolini was made the Prime Minister. He succeeded because political parties did not show commitment to work the parliamentary system. Because of the number of fascists outside the parliament swelled, because Mussolini gave to the fascist movement a vitality that was in sharp contrast with a dull and tired government, and because both the king and the politicians cooperated to bring him into the government. Though the political program of Mussolini remained vague, the influence of fascist squads continued to increase, and he began to get support from property owners in general as also from businessmen. The church too became sympathetic when he began to make conciliatory speeches about the Roman Catholic Church. In September 1922, he announced that he had dropped the Republican part of his program. Thereafter, the king also began to view fascists favorably. He became head of a 14-member cabinet, of which only 3 were fascist. The majority of the Italians agreed because they wished to avoid the threat of social revolution and because they did not expect a fundamental change in institutions. During his public appearances, furious crowds saluted him as a leader with cries of "Dues, dues." It seems that he had created a successful alternative to both capitalist democracy and Soviet communism. Mussolini gave industrialists a free band and patronized big business through state investment and government contracts. Labor unions and socialist groups were destroyed and only fascist unions were allowed. Workers were deprived even of their basic rights to move from one job to another without official permission. The school curriculum was revised to make it an instrument of fascist propaganda. Fascist youth organizations were used to encourage young persons to spy on their families and report about anti-fascist sentiments. However, Mussolini had to preserve the monarchy and the church. In 1929, he made an agreement with the Pope that settled the question of the Pope's temporal power by restoring his sovereignty to the Vatican City and recognizing Catholicism as the sole religion of Italy. This brought the hostility between the Italian state and the church, which had lasted for about 60 years, to an end. Under Mussolini, the armed forces also continued to enjoy some independence. Economically, Italy remained backward, though this was concealed by massive propaganda. In 1938, Mussolini adopted anti-Semitism as the official policy. In 1942, when Hitler adopted the final solution, we will speak about it later on, Italian forces were also instructed to work for extermination of European Jews. But as Mussolini's authority declined after 1942, Italian officers sabotaged such policies and did not cooperate. In foreign policy, Mussolini did not have any clear goal. However, he wanted to bring good glory to Italy by following an expansionist policy. He invaded Ethiopia and brought it under Italy's control in 1936. Thus, the humiliation of 1896 was avenged. This increased Mussolini's prestige tremendously. The Italian used Barbarossa's method to break the resistance of Ethiopians, which included chemical warfare and mass executions. In 1936, Mussolini's Italy left the League of Nations and joined Hitler, and thus the Rome-Berlin axis was formed. In 1939, Mussolini invaded Albania and conquered it with great difficulty. In May, he signed the Pact of Steel with Hitler. In the World War, the Italian army failed to conquer Greece or to suppress Serbian resistance. In 1943, when Italy's surrender was announced, Nazis took over power in North Italy. Ultimately, 2 days before Hitler committed suicide, Mussolini was shot by some Italian partisans and was then hung upside down from a garage roof in Milan. Now, let's talk about Hitler and Nazism in Germany. In Germany, in the elections of 1928, Hitler parties got only 12 seats, but then came the World Depression. It undermined the stability of all newly established regimes. The problems arising out of the ways of handling this unprecedented crisis led to the resignation of Hermann Müller and set in train the chain of events that led to establishment of a brutal totalitarian regime under Hitler. Given the consequences of the establishment of the Nazi regime, more than 60 years after Hitler committed suicide in a bunker in Berlin, the question why Germans followed him so blindly continues to be heatedly debated. During the First World War, he joined the German army. He could only move beyond corporal rank, though he earned medals for his bravery. He was shattered by Germany's defeat in the war. He was shocked by the humiliation of Germany at Versailles and began to make speeches to small audiences in streets. In 1919, he joined a small party called German Workers' Party. Here, he had his mark as a skilled orator who could move the masses by the charm of his language. He dared to say what his audiences were afraid to express. In 1921, he took over his party and named it the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Later, this became known as Nazi, being the first part of the German way of pronouncing the word national. He established a paramilitary arm of the party also, which became known as the Storm Troopers, to police the meetings of the Nazi party. The party expanded rapidly. Its members wore special badges and uniforms, and they marched robot-like through the streets of Munich. During the 1920s, the Nazi party was an obscure, not every successful party, and remained on political fringe. This changed as a result of Hitler's persistent drive from power circumstances. This changed as a result of Hitler's persistent drive for power, lack of commitment against Germany for parliamentary democracy, and circumstances arising out of world depression. In November 1923, Hitler attempted what is known as the Beer Hall Uprising to come to power when he led a march of his followers from the Beer Hall at Munich. The police broke up this march and arrested Hitler. He was tried for treason. He used his trial for propagated his views. He was sent to prison where he wrote autobiography with the title My Struggle or Mein Kampf. His contemporaries as well as historians tended to dismiss it as of dogmas that echoed the conversation of any cafe in Germany. But this is to underestimate his book. It is partly a misleading biography, partly a repetition of folkish or simple folk ideas that were commonplace in Germany during the preceding decades, partly a political program and partly a handbook on political action. He was explicit about the need to take revenge for the humiliation of 1919. He harped on the virtues of the German stock, which he left undefined, and the natural superiority of the German people, whom he called Aryan. He talked of including all German-speaking people living in Austria, Sudeten area of Czechoslovakia, and Denjing in the proposed Third Reich. He also argued that Germany lacked space for a healthy expansion of German people, and hence he elucidated the concept of Lebensraum, that is the living space to which Germans were entitled. This meant acquisition of territories outside the areas where Germans lived. Thus Hitler spelled out his foreign policy goals explicitly. He also expressed a fear and paranoid hatred of the Jews. He made it clear that it would be his task to solve the Jewish question by radical and brutal means. After his release from prison in 1925, Hitler began to describe himself As a writer, he devoted himself to nurturing his party. During 1925 to 1929, Hitler was fairly well known, but for the Nazi Party, these were lean years. The depression turned him into a figure of Napoleonic proportions. He denounced Versailles, unearned income and unfair taxes. Above all, he denounced the Jews. In anti-Semitism, he got the lowest common denominator on which all classes and all parties could unite. There were 600,000 Jews in Germany, that is 1% of the population. Hitler could afford to antagonize the Jews. In September 1930, with a view to win popular legitimacy, Brüning called for a general election. It was Hitler who played on the anxiety of the German voters, centering on the economic situation. The Nazis won 107 seats and emerged as the second largest party behind the Social Democratic Party. Nazism did represent a broad mass movement while other parties represented narrow interest groups. Hitler also made very efficient use of the mass media. The political history of Germany during 1932 to 33 is full of miscalculations. When the economic crisis had reached its lowest point in 1932, the term of office of Hindenburg expired. Hitler chose to stand against him and lost. He got 13 million votes as against the 19 million that the president got. This happened despite the fact that the new Chancellor Brüning banned the SA, the political party, while the Social Democratic Party, the Centre Party and the Liberals urged the voters to support Hindenburg. In 1932, election for the legislature was held twice in July and November. Hitler openly said that the aim of the Nazi Party was the destruction of the Weimar Republic. In the July elections, the Nazis emerged as the largest single party, winning 37% of the vote and 230 seats. This made the Nazi Party the largest parliamentary group to sit in the legislature since 1920, as also a party for which a highest proportions of electors voted. After these elections, Hindenburg was persuaded to accept that the parliamentary crisis could be resolved only by offering chancellorship to Hitler. It seems that by this time, Germany's ruling classes began to feel that the only way to escape from a deep economic crisis was to hand political power to a totalitarian movement. On 30th January 1933, Hitler became the chancellor in a coalition cabinet. Hitler had insisted on new elections as a condition of accepting office. Hitler desired a 2/3 majority, which was necessary to pass the enabling law, which could enable Hitler to pass any law he wanted without regard for parliamentary approval. At this stage, there was a fire in the building of the Legislative Assembly. Hitler blamed the communists for this act, though there was no proof. He also used this as a pretext for imposing a state of emergency. Despite declaring a state of emergency, use of unparalleled violence, intimidations in the electoral campaign by the Nazis, and vigorous use of press and radio, the Nazi Party could secure only 44% of votes and 288 seats. Yet the Enabling Act was forcibly passed. Only the Centre Party supported Hitler and only the Social Democrats proved courageous enough to vote against the motion. Thereafter, Hitler dismantled what was left of the democratic setup and inaugurated one of the worst regimes known to history. Thereafter, Hitler organized a plebiscite, as a result of which the office of President and Chancellor were merged. Like his hero Mussolini, Hitler took the title of Führer or leader, Adolf Hitler, leader of the right and people. The army was made to swear a personal oath of loyalty to him as he head of the state, thus subordinated its office crops to Hitler's will. Germany under Hitler did not have a constitution. It was governed under the emergency decrees of 1934. He called his empire the Third German Empire or Reich, the first being the Holy Roman Catholic Empire and the second that of 1871 to 1918. This third empire rose and fell with Hitler. During 1933-34, Hitler destroyed most of the institutions of a free society. In March 1933, the independent powers of federal states were abolished. From April, the civil service, including the judiciary, he eliminated political opponents of Nazism, Jews, and persons of Jewish descent. In May, trade unions were suppressed and replaced by the German Labor Front controlled by Nazis. In January 1934, the upper house of parliament was abolished. In June 1934, Hitler eliminated the SA, on whom he had depended during his years of struggle. Because their leaders were becoming ambitious, they and other political opponents were murdered brutally on the night of 30th June 1934 during what became known as the Night of Long Knives. In the universities, famous books by anti-Nazi and Jewish authors were burned. Universities did not put up resistance, nor did theologians. Many Jews, such as Albert Einstein, began to leave the country, as did a few Christian Germans, such as Nobel Prize winning author Thomas Mann. All political parties either disbanded themselves or were outlawed. The Center Party of Roman Catholic agreed to dissolve itself in exchange for an agreement between the Vatican and Hitler, under which the Roman Catholic Church disbanded its political, social, and professional organizations in return for permission to run schools and to publish pastoral letters. Many bishops guarded these privileges carefully. The stand of Protestant churches remained ambiguous. The Protestants shared nationalist sentiments of the Nazis. They failed to condemn the treatment of the Jews or the Nazi program. At the same time, one should appreciate that both Protestant and Roman Catholic churches stood firmly against Nazi attempts to make them approve racial theories as defined in the Nuremberg Law of 1935. During 1933 and 34, Hitler implemented what was called the process of coordination or falling in line. It was a complex procedure designed to impose Nazi values on everyday German life and to compel obedience. Every area of German life was Nazified. Nazis promoted the image of a monolithic, efficient, and harmonious state under a charismatic Führer. He was represented as one above conflicts and factions. But the Nazi state was no efficient monolith. Hitler often set up competing agencies without any clear division of power that were accountable to him alone. At the same time, he was not a weak dictator. He proved himself to be skilled tactician and manipulator, but in the details of policy implementation, he was simply less interested. Ambitious Nazi leaders carved out empires of influence for themselves. In March 1933, a ministry was created with the curious title Ministry of Popular Enlightenment and Propaganda under Joseph Goebbels. Its function was to create the feeling that the nation enthusiastically supported Hitler. It used the press, radio, and the educational system for political introduction, indoctrination, as well as for light entertainment. It floated many schemes to inculcate a sense of harmonious, regenerated community. Social organizations such as Hitler Youth League, League of German Girls, and women's organizations were created to infuse Germans with a new spirit. A range of programs such as leisure activities and holiday trips with names such as Beauty of Labor and Strength Through Joy were designed to inculcate a sense of community at the factory level. Hitler was clear that for the survival of his regime, he had to succeed on the economic front. He chose his advisors carefully. The economy was tightly controlled by the government. In 1936, a 4-year plan was adopted for economic growth and for creating self-sufficiency by increasing the production of vital raw materials such as synthetic rubber, fuel, oil, and iron ore. Expenditure on armaments and public works, especially roads, also increased rapidly. By 1938, the full employment level was reached. In fact, by 1939, there was shortage of labor. Though wages, especially of workers, did not rise in real terms, they saw security of employment as a great benefit. The most peculiar aspect of the Nazi regime was the persecution of the Jewish people with a brutality. Hitler considered the Jewish people to be un-German and propounded pseudoscientific theories for this purpose. The idea was not entirely new, and Jewish people had been the earliest scapegoats in the world. In medieval times, in many European countries, Jews were barred from owning land, and therefore they engaged themselves in trade and money lending. They were made to live in areas especially marked for them called ghettos. In Germany, the ideas of Völkisch nationalism, social Darwinism, anti-Semitism, and quest for living space for Germans had been discussed in the 19th century. But Hitler's ideas went beyond anything envisaged before his rise to power. After coming to power, he began to implement his dreams of creating a racially pure state and of acquiring territory for additional resources. The Nazi racist vision rested on hierarchy of racial value. The finest in the race hierarchy were what he called Aryan, to which, according to Hitler, all pure Germans belonged. The Nazis held that the Aryan people should be nurtured by the state, and the others seen as useless eaters should be denied resources. Even German liberals came to believe that the Jewish people were different and that they were a race. At the beginning of the Nazi era, it seems that there was no blueprint for killing the Jewish people. In 1933, a boycott of Jewish shops and business establishments were introduced. The Jewish were barred from employment as lawyers, doctors, or journalists. However, for discrimination against the Jewish people to be effective, it was essential to have a clear definition of who was or was not a Jew. This was done by passing what became known as the Nuremberg Law in September 1935 at a rally of the Nazi Party at Nuremberg, which was later approved by the German legislature in a special session. These laws classified people as German if all four of their grandparents were of German blood. It was made clear that a person with even one Jewish grandparent must be classified as a Jew. The laws deprived the Jews of their German citizenship and forbade them to marry non-Jews. In 1938, the German Jews were allowed to leave Germany but without their possessions. Until this time, the Jewish people saw these measures as an expression of the centuries-old wave of persecution. But on the notorious night of 8-9 November 1939, Jewish homes and shops were looted and many Jewish people were killed. This, together with some speeches of Hitler, seemed to be a presentiment of the fear that Jews would be excluded from Germany's glorious future. From September 1941, all the Jewish people living within the Nazi Empire, including Germany, were required to wear a yellow badge. The external aspiration of Hitler can be described as imperialist and colonialist. Nazi policies were guided by brutal instinct, arising out of a sense of racial superiority to kill people. Once in power, he never lost sight of his goals. To ease fears abroad, he continued to make speeches that Germany desired peace, and at the same time he made an all-out attempt to strengthen Germany militarily. In 1935, the League of Nations organized a plebiscite to decide on the future of the Saar region. 90% of voters opted for restoration of the area to Germany, and it was incorporated into Germany. In 1936, Hitler sent his army to occupy Rhineland, which been made a demilitarized zone under the Treaty of Versailles. This was welcomed by the Germans because it removed one of the grievances created by 1919. Meanwhile, in March 1935, the German government held a conference to announce what everybody already knew, that Germany was rearming. Conscription was reintroduced and a massive program of expansion was undertaken in 1937. At a meeting of the heads of the armed forces, the record of which was survived, Hitler made clear that the aim of Germany policy was conquest in the East, which might provoke a war with France and Britain. Thereafter, Hitler began to replace moderate heads and from leading positions by enthusiastic and supportive Nazi leaders. Hitler himself became Minister for War. In March 1938, Hitler sent German troops over the border to secure unification with Austria. There was no resistance in Austria. German nationalists in both countries felt that a great wrong had been done in 1866 when Bismarck took the decisions to create the German state without Austria, and that an even greater wrong was done when the Allies refused to allow Austria to join the German Republic in 1919. Thereafter, a plebiscite was organized so effectively in Germany and Austria as to give Hitler a vote of over 99%. Hitler annexed a part of Czechoslovakia, Sudetenland, with the express approval of Britain, France and Italy given at the Munich meeting in September 1938. In 1939, he annexed the rest of Czechoslovakia. On 1st September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. At this stage, Britain and France decided to restrain Hitler and the Second World War started. Hitler had not expected this. From him, the war came 3 to 4 years too early because his preparations were still incomplete. Germany has been held responsible for unleashing the Second World War. During this war, the Germans not only created an empire stretching from Atlantic coast of France to the Ural Mountains in Russia and from the North Cape in Norway to the Mediterranean Sea, but also used the resources of the modernized European state to murder millions. After Poland was conquered in its northwest part, ethnically pure Germans were brought and settled, and the undesirable were shifted to southeast Poland, and later this region was used for extermination the Jewish people. There is a measure of agreement about the point at which inhuman decisions to kill all Jews indirectly, called the final solution, was taken. From June 1941, the Germans won overwhelming victory over the Soviet Red Army, which increased the number of Jewish people in the eastern ghettos. In September 1941, the decision to turn their deportation into their murder was taken. In 1942, extermination camps, death factories as they were called, were established. Jewish people were brought to these camps, mostly in goods trains, and mass killings were organized with scientific precision. One method used was to burn them in gas chambers. The estimators are that 6 to 7 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust. Some 2 million Soviet prisoners taken during Operation Barbarossa died mostly because of starvation, and some 100,000 gypsies, disabled and mentally sick persons were killed in Enthusiana program. Fascism in Japan. Like Italy and Germany, the Japanese felt deeply hurt by the treatment they received in the peace settlement of 1919. They also resented that at the Naval Limitation Conference held at Washington in 1922, Japan was assigned a secondary position in the Pacific region. After the war, Japan also saw spontaneous riot in many regions over the rocketing price of rice. The immediate threat from the left was not perceived to be as serious as in Italy and Germany, yet the government was alarmed. But soon the Japanese were able to experience prosperity. One reason for this was that the Japanese pre-war rivals Russia and Germany had collapsed, and this increased the demand for Japanese goods. The period from 1924 to 1932 was the most democratic period in Japan since the constitution was adopted in 1889. In 1925, the military budget was reduced by 25% and universal mail franchise was introduced for those aged 25 and above. Externally, the government adopted for diplomatic solution to international problems. Many associations sprang up which saw the military as a potential force in politics and aimed at reviving Japan's traditional values. In 1923, Kita Iki, a political theorist, published a handbook entitled Reconstruction of Japan, in which combining socialism with radical nationalism. He proposed a coup d'etat to replace the then existing political structure with a military dictatorship. He also suggested that after strengthening itself internally, Japan should embark on a crusade to free all of Asia from Western dominance. Though this book was banned immediately by the government, it became a handbook for action for young army officers and revolutionary nationalists. In September 1931, the Guangdong Army, in response to a staged terrorist incident, attacked Manchuria and captured it. It was not annexed, but a puppet government under the last Manchu emperor was installed, while real power was taken by Japan. The League of Nations, after a prolonged inquiry, merely censured Japan. Meanwhile, the Japanese army and navy attacked on Shanghai, including aerial bombing of the city and occupied parts of Inner Mongolia. The press, the public opinion, and the nationalists in Japan celebrated these occupied bold moves. They saw the military as a positive force in politics and the political parties as weak. These events strengthened the desire for territorial expansion. The fear of inability to absorb the growing population was increasingly expressed, and by 1930 it was thought that Japan would have to acquire new places to create a space for them, a Japanese version of Lebensraum. The sense of racial superiority got translated into a belief that their historic mission was to civilize the lesser races of Asia, to remove Western influences from Asia, and to lead the region. Every liberal prime minister that Hirohito appointed was murdered. The year 1936 saw what is described as February 26 incidents, when young Japanese military officers attempted a coup, during which they occupied governmental building in central Tokyo and murdered several ministers and generals. In November of the same year, Japan signed the Anti-Comintern Pact with Germany. In 1937, Japan withdrew from the disarmament system of the League of Nations. On 7th July 1937, there was a brief skirmish at Marco Polo Bridge in Beijing between Japan's Guangdong Army and the Chinese Army, which has become known as the Marco Polo Incident. This developed into a full-scale war between Japan and China by mid-August. The Japanese military was expecting a victory in 3 months. The Japanese army saw in the war an opportunity to expand in Southeast Asia, where France controlled Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Annam, Tonkin, and some other areas, and Holland had a huge empire covering Sumatra, Java, part of Borneo, and other islands. The chief obstacles in the way of advance in this direction was the USA, which controlled the Philippines and had military establishment in the other island in the Pacific. In September 1940, Japan concluded the Tripartite Treaty with the victorious side, that is Germany and Italy. In June 1940, Japan conquered Indochina. The United States was not ready to let the Southeast Asian region pass under an ambitious power like Japan. On 7th December, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. America was taken by surprise. The Japanese Air Force destroyed 5 American battleships and over a dozen other ships, and destroyed or damaged some 350 aircraft. It was a calculated move for war against the United States, Britain, and Holland. America declared war on Japan the following day. Japan thus became involved in war against America, Britain, China, and Dutch coalition. During the first half of the 1942, the Japanese achieved a string of military victories on par with Hitler's success in Western Europe and vanquished the Americans, Britain, and Dutch power in the Pacific. The victorious Japanese soldiers looked upon the conquered people not as human beings but as spoils of war. They tortured, slaughtered, worked to death, or burned prisoners of war, even patients in hospitals. They let people die of hunger and disease and raped women. By the end of 1942, Japanese tide of conquest was stemmed for Japan as well as for Germany. The war ended in humiliating surrender, and with this the fascist government ceased to exist. The Nazi Party was dissolved after Hitler's death in April 1945. In Japan, the emperor was restored. Whatever name one gives to the development in Japan between 1930 and 45, there were many similar features in Japan to those in Germany and Italy: anti-liberalism, anti-communism, emphasis on national community, expansion of the country's military capacity, determination to suppress all opposition to the regime, a very ambitious self-serving policy of acquiring territory, a keen sense of racial superiority, and the brutal manner in which other human beings were treated. They all also shared the same experience of failure. The experience of this total war, caused mainly by fascism and militarism, has left permanent scars on human history. Fascism was a response to the post-war situation arising out of political instability, dissatisfied nationalist hope, and fear of a spread of communism. It was also an expression of hostility to liberal democratic values and had proved spiritless and ineffective in the face of irrational decisions taken during the World War, which caused so much unnecessary destruction. The emergence and spread of fascist movement was the reflection of disorientation caused by these factors. Fascism was most successful in countries that had a weak democratic tradition. In all three countries, Italy, Germany and Japan, the leadership used modern bureaucracy and technology to fashion a social order that devalued and depersonalized the individual. In art, architecture, literature and music, these regimes stifled innovation and originality. They did not produce anything of lasting value even in the fields of politics or economics. Anti-democratic and illiberal fascist ideologies altered political life and ultimately caused unprecedented and mindless destruction. Thank you.